shall talk about the origin of ancient Greek comedy. Dear students, tragedy was not the only product of Athens' flourishing theatre culture. Comedy also thrived. Not only did the Greeks produce many lasting comedies, they also cast the mold for many Roman, Elizabethan, and modern comedies. The historical development of comedy was not as well recorded as that of tragedy. Aristotle notes in the Poetics that before his own time, comedy was considered trivial and common, though when it was finally recognized as an art form, the orphan suddenly had many fathers. The evolution of comedy is much simpler than that of its sister art. Though, as to its origin and earlier development, there is little exact information. All that Aristotle can tell us is that it first took shape in Megaris and Sicyon, whose people were noted for their coarse humor and sense of the ludicrous, and that Caesarion, the earliest comic poet, was a native of a Megara town. Add to this that it arose from the phallic processions of the Greeks, as did tragedy from the Dithyramb, and we have about all that is known as to the inception of the lighter branch of the drama. Comedy seems to have sprung into being at the vintage festivals of the Greek villagers, when all was jovial gaiety and everyone had jesting license in honor of Dionysus. At such a time, it was a custom for the people to pass from village to village, some in carts, uttering the vile jests and abuse unjustly attributed to the tragic choruses, others on foot, bearing aloft the phallic emblem and singing the praises of Phaelis, the comrade of Bacchus. In cities, it was also customary that after an evening banquet, young men would roam around the streets with torches in their hands, headed by a lyre or flute player. Such a band of revelers was called a comus, and a member of the band a commodus or comus singer, and the song itself being termed a commoedia or comedy, just as a song of satyrs was named a tragoedia or tragedy. The word commoedia means literally in Greek party song, and if this is any indication of its origin, then dramatic comedy stems from revels, that is komoi, the singular of which is komos, where partiers, that is komastai, sang songs or oidai, in which they teased, mocked and made fools of spectators or public figures. A recent historian of the origin of art has reminded us that on public occasions, the common mood, whether joy or sorrow, was often communicated even to those who were originally possessed by the opposite feeling. So powerful was the infection of excitement that a sober man would join in the antics of his drunken comrades, yielding to a drunkenness by induction. These seasons of contagious revelry were exactly suited to the development of double desire of mankind for personation, that is, one man seeking to get outside of his own and to assume a character not his own, while another finds his satisfaction rather in the observation of this simulation and just being a sympathetic spectator. So it came to pass that there were companies of young fellows, often disguised grossly as beasts or birds, who would break out into riotous phallic dances, enjoyed equally by those who looked on and by those who took part. Early Greek vase paintings, not written texts, provide at present our best view of dramatic comedy in its primordial stages. In particular, depictions of what seem to be comic choruses. Dating to the mid-6th century BC, some vases show commastai dressed as horses, birds and dolphins, prefiguring the courses of later 5th century Old Comedy, in which choristers often represented animals. In time, these dancers grouped themselves in rival bands, the leaders of which indulged in a give and take of banter and repartee, which was certainly vulgar and personal and probably as direct and artless as the chop-logic dialogues of the modern ringmaster and circus clown. The happy improvisation of this carnival spirit, which happened to delight the crowd one year, would surely be repeated the next year deliberately, perhaps only to evoke an unexpected retort. Thereafter, it would be conjoined in what might prove to be the nucleus of a comic scene of some length. Thus, a species would tend to appear as the tradition was handed down from season to season, enriching itself constantly with the accretions of every venturesome jester. However frail this framework might be, it would be likely to contain a rough realization of the more obvious types of rural characters, and almost from the beginning there would be abundant and irreverent parody of heroic legend and of religious myth. Dear students, the phallic processions were continued as late as the days of Aristotle, and we learn from one of the orations of Demosthenes that the riotous youths who infested the streets of Athens delighted in their comic buffooneries. Pasquinades of the coarsest kind were part of the exhibitions, and hence, probably, it was that comedy found a home at Athens during the time of Pericles, for it furnished the demagogues with a safe and convenient means of attacking their political opponents. When formally established as a branch of the drama, it had its chorus, though less numerous and costly than the dithyrambic choir. The actors, at first without masks, disguised their features by smearing them with the lees of wine. Then in time, this inchoate medley of ribald song and phallic dance and abusive repartee came to feel the influence of the other dramatic species, that is, the tragedy, origin of which was quite as humble. Tragedy had been organized at last with its chorus and its 3 actors. Indeed, the same native instinct which led the Greeks to regulate tragedy and to attach it to a festival of the state suggested sooner or later that comedy should also be adopted by the city. Greek comedy, when taken over by the authorities, was apparently far less advanced and more archaic than Greek tragedy had been when first officially regulated. In the earlier dramatic poems of Aeschylus, we perceive tragedy not yet developed out of the dithyramb and struggling to find its own form. Similarly, in the earlier comedies of Aristophanes, we discover not only a primitive but a very peculiar stage of the evolution of the comic drama. Just as Aeschylus, with his dominating chorus, sometimes seems closer to the earlier rustic lyric, Aristophanes is even closer. His work is often so formless, his story sometimes so disconnected, his plot so carelessly put together that it forces us to the conclusion that the Greeks had not yet perceived the need of unity in the comic drama, which is so striking a characteristic of their greater tragedy. Owing to this slowness of the Greeks in evolving a type of pure comedy, as they had already evolved a type of pure tragedy, the works of Aristophanes impress us with their strangeness and their inequality. Friends, three of the most important phases of Greek tragedy are preserved for us in the extant dramas of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. There were three phases in Greek comedy also, although less clearly distinguished, and here we have not been so lucky. To represent an early stage of its evolution, we have half a score of the lyrical burlesques of Aristophanes, but only a single play of his survives, just to suggest to us the kind of comic drama which was acceptable in the second period when other humorous playwrights rivaled him. The third epoch, illustrated by the noble name of Menander, can be but guessed at, since we do not have the complete manuscript of even a single play by him. Yet, an attempt to trace in outline the development of the Greek comic drama is not an altogether impossible task, despite our deficiency in illustrative examples. Given the cultivated and scholarly culture of its ruling elite, Athens invited satire. Aristophanes assumed the task with zeal, aiming his lampoonery at those who stuck their heads above the crowd. The Athenian audience was well versed in its highbrow culture and must have enjoyed these in-jokes immensely. Other targets of Aristophanes included Aeschylus and Euripides, whom Aristophanes portrayed variously as a windbag and corrupter of youth with his heretical ideas. The comedy of Aristophanes was a medley of boisterous comic opera, lofty lyric poetry, vulgar ballet, patriotic oratory, indecent farce, pungent political satire, acrobatic pantomime, brilliant literary criticism, cheap burlesque, and of daringly imaginative fantasy. Obviously, most of these elements have no necessary relation to the drama, and one by one they were eliminated. The political personalities had to go first, then the lyric poetry, and the imaginative fantasy. The Plutus of Aristophanes himself seems to be a specimen of this uncertain transition stage, in which the humorous poet is sadly shorn of his exuberance. He is not content to deal with the commonplace occurrences of everyday life, and the theme he treats is really a fable. Yet, in Plutus, the absence of the more extravagant elements of his lyrical burlesques brings the later play closer to comedy, as we now understand it, than were the earlier pieces. It is very interesting to note that in the course of a few years after Aristophanes, Greek comedy still further simplified itself. It gave up the parabasis, always an undramatic excrescence, and it surrendered the chorus, thus abandoning at once the ballet and the opera. It made up for the loss of these things by elaborating the more dramatic elements, by relying upon the delineation of character, by giving more thought to the building up of the plot and to the invention of comic situations. It also responded to the influence of the more realistic treatment of life which Euripides had introduced into tragedy. Indeed, it is quite possible that there was a fairly close agreement in method and in attitude between Euripides, the last of the great writers of Greek tragedy, and Menander, the first of the great writers of Greek comedy. In the plays of Euripides, we discover that the chorus lingers like an atrophied organ, which the dramatist dared not amputate out of regard for tradition. In the plays of Menander, we note that the needful operation has taken place. At the hands of Euripides, the chorus serves only to fill out the lyric interludes of the dramatic action. And it is this music that Menander omits. Greek tragedy had been lyrical in its origin and was perforce poetic, whereas after Aristophanes, Greek comedy was free to be prosaic, as was needful in dealing more directly with the facts of everyday existence. Comedy developed along similar lines as tragedy did, becoming more aimed at the common people and less concerned with its religious origins. By 317 BC, a new form had evolved that resembled modern farces. The use of overt satire, topicality, and the pointed lampooning of celebrated characters to be found in the style of Aristophanes were replaced by mistaken identities, ironic situations, ordinary characters, and wit. This period is called New Comedy, and its main practitioner was Menander. Most of his plays are now lost, but parts found their way into plays by the Roman playwrights Plautus and Terence, whom Julius Caesar called a half Menander. From these works, they were incorporated into Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors. And Stephen Sondheim's A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. In 1905, a manuscript was discovered in Cairo that contained pieces of 5 Menander plays. And in 1957, a complete play, Dyskolos, of 317 BC was unearthed in Egypt. Menander's main contribution was to create a comedy model that greatly influenced later comedy. Unlike Aristophanes, his characters were not celebrities but ordinary people. The chorus in Menander's plays resembled a modern chorus, singers and dancers who provided fillers between acts. Menander sometimes portrayed them as drunken audience. His characters were classic comedy archetypes such as the curmudgeonly old man in The Grouch, who would become staple of comedy. Most of all, the style of comedy that Menander created, with its emphasis on mistaken identity, romance and situational humor, became the model for subsequent comedy from the Romans to Shakespeare to Broadway. Unfortunately for us, no play of Menander's has survived. We have a few fragments of scenes, we have many quoted sentences, we have the Latin adaptations of Plautus and Terence, but we do not have a single complete play by which we could make up our own minds as to his dramatic skills. We can judge of him as a poet and a moralist by means of the lines preserved here and there by his admirers. Although we do have one copy of Terence which seems to have been derived from Menander without admixture, but this is really not enough to give any judgment as to his play-making faculty. We are at liberty to guess that Menander found compensation for sinking from the lyrical heights of Aristophanes by not descending into the depths of base vulgarity in which the earlier poet revelled. We may surmise that his plays were often genuine comedies rather than mere farces, because he sought the truth of life itself rather than the boisterous laughter evoked by exaggeration. Certainly, his contemporaries continually testify to the veracity of his scenes. Chamfort points out that on the stage the aim is effect, but the difference between a good dramatist and the bad is that the former seeks effect by reasonable means, while for the latter any and all means are excellent. In other words, the plays of Menander seem to have been an anticipation of the modern comedy of manners. The plots were ingenious and plausible, and they were peopled with characters common in Athens at that time. The miserly father, the spendthrift son, the intriguing servant, the braggart soldier, the obsequious parasite, and the woman of pleasure. In Athens, respectable women took no part in social life, remaining at home and caring for their households. In Greek comedy, therefore, women are little seen, and those who do appear belong to the less respectable classes. And this, no doubt, is the most serious limitation of Greek comedy. To Menander himself, the deprivation is most injurious, since he obviously possessed the delicacy of perception that would have enabled him to handle feminine character with insight and subtlety. His prevailing tone, as Professor Jebb notes, is that of polite conversation, not without passages of tender sentiment, grave thought, or almost tragic pathos. Friends, although the chorus had disappeared in Menander's day, the tradition of the mask still survived. The mask was probably a pasteboard head, not unlike those now seen in our comic pantomimes. A great variety of them had been modeled for use in comedy, each of which served to declare at once the character of the wearer and to announce on his first appearance whether, for instance, he was a dutiful young man or a wanton prodigal. Indeed, there were said to be 10 distinct masks available for the several young men of the play, 9 for the old men and 7 for the slaves. masks were an utmost necessity in the theatre of Athens because of its vastness. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for the spectators to perceive the changing expression and the mobility of feature which on the modern stage add so much to our enjoyment. Probably, moreover, the Athenian of old was no more annoyed by the facial rigidity of the masked characters. Plato defined comedy as the generic name for all exhibitions which have a tendency to excite laughter. True. Nevertheless, another fact also needs to be mentioned, that although the development of comedy was mainly due to the political and social conditions of Athens, it finally held up the mirror to all that was characteristic of Athenian life. Thank you.